Hi, it's my pleasure to introduce Fred Morstatter, who is our AI seminar speaker for the day. Fred is a research assistant professor in computer science. He's also a research team lead at ISI. He's done a lot of great work on understanding social media, as well as building a fairer world. So, examples of that include looking at bias in different social networks and different sources of knowledge. And today he's going to talk a little bit about how we can understand the mental models and what's going on, behind the scenes. So, a big welcome for Fred. And if you have questions and you're online, there is a Q&A on Zoom. So please post your questions and I will relay them to Fred. So it's all welcome, Fred.
Thanks, everybody. Nice to meet you. The title of my talk is Uncovering and Reasoning with Implicit Mental Models. Probably didn't need the second title slide, but if you want my email address to talk to me afterwards, there it is. So what I'm presenting today is an effort that we've been working on for a couple of years now here at ISI, and a lot of you in the room have been, part of that. Christina, Jay, Fiona for a while, Parth, among others. And the big idea here is that we want to do better cultural modeling. So when we talk about culture, really these are kind of the shared understandings that people use to navigate the world. And if we can understand them, we can do a better job of modeling human behavior. But the problem is that a lot of these rules are not explicit. They're implicit. They're understood by the members of that community. They're not written down, but they're agreed upon, and they use these things to navigate the world. And if we can understand those rules, we should be able to better predict how people are going to behave. So here are a couple examples of this. So kind of the canonical example is the Ebola epidemic in 2014. So there were a lot of watchdog groups trying to forecast the amount of Ebola that was going to happen, and their forecasts were largely underperforming. And a big reason for that was because they didn't understand the burial practices of the local communities. So in many of these communities, when somebody dies of anything, including Ebola, they would take the person's body home for a few days, and they would do some ceremonies inside before the person was ultimately buried. And that's really bad news for Ebola, right? Because that's exactly when Ebola can spread. And if we had known that, if we had known about these practices, we could have better forecasted Ebola. Similarly, and indeed the case that we focus on in this talk is violence around the world. So a lot of communities around the world are subject to violence from extremist groups, war, et cetera, et cetera. How they respond to that violence is often implicit. How they prepare their communities to protect it, to fortify it prior to that violence is also not exactly written down. And if we can do that, if we can understand that, again, we should be able to better forecast violence and its outcomes, fatalities, events, et cetera, et cetera. Specifically, what we're focusing on in terms of violence is one particular area of the world, Cabo Delgado, Mozambique. This is a particularly interesting part of the world. So there was an insurgency that started there around 2017, it was very fledgling. And then in 2019, this oil company, Total Energies, decided that they wanted to, they found liquefied natural gas, LNG. They said, okay, we're gonna start a big plant off of the coast of Cabo Delgado to extract that LNG. They put $20 billion into that plant. It's the largest infrastructure project in Africa for a time. And of course, the insurgents in the area said, we want a part of that, we want to control that. So that led to, increased violence in the region. And because of all this violence, there are all sorts of actors that got involved. The Wagner Group, you might have heard of them. They were there for a spell, right? There's also a South African mercenary group that was involved. Ultimately, the Rwandans got involved, et cetera. And really, there's no clear, resolution or end in sight to this violence. And that's really unfortunate for the local communities there because, they're constantly being subject to violence. This is a very rural area in northern Mozambique. A lot of farmers, crops, et cetera. Relatively low connectivity, relatively low literacy rate. And that makes it difficult for us to really, get in there and understand what it is they're doing. So, yes.
So which country is kind of back in the LNG project?
Well, Total Energies is French. They're a French company.
Oh, French.
Yeah. But really, it's all in the interest of that particular.
And is there a colonial connection between France and?
No, Mozambique was a Portuguese colony.
Okay.
Oh,
right, that's right.
Yeah, occupied by the Germans for a little bit, but mostly Portugal. No, the Total just saw they did. They do surveying, right? And they found a ton of LNG, and they said we want to start up there, and then they made agreements with the government and so on. So this leads us to the project that we've been working on. So this is kind of a computational approach that's also backed by surveys and principles from social science in order to understand what those values are of the community and to leverage them to do better prediction. So this is a really high level 40,000 foot view of the system. What we do is we first start out by learning everything we can about the population from the web, right? That's remote sensing. So we have things like Telegram. Telegram is used a lot in Mozambique. We have news. We have violence reports from watchdog groups and things like that. And then from there, we do a lot of basically, let's say NLP on it. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more depth later. So first, we start off with a relation extraction. So we try to find mentions of events in the text. And we also score that text for different features that should be useful. So one of the things we look at is moral foundations. So if you're not familiar with moral foundations theory, it's this theory that says that every group around the world kind of adheres to these 5 or 6 principles, but they adhere to them in different proportions. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to measure those proportions from what they say online. Similarly, we do emotion extraction. So what emotions are being used when these moral expressions occur. We also try to identify spoken or uttered, let's say, causal relationships. And all these things get fed together and they form this kind of big knowledge graph about all of the events that we're seeing mentioned online about the region, in this case, Cabo Delgado. But of course, we want these things to be correct, both our measures and our understanding of what's going on the ground. So to that end, what we do is we have a survey approach where we actually go out into the region and we ask people design questions that can help us to better understand and contextualize what it is we see in the knowledge graph, to identify where things could be wrong, and to identify biases, places where we may have overlooked in our remote sensing approach. Because as we said, right, this area has very low connectivity, right? So if you just look at online data, you're going to be looking at data from the best off people in Cabo Delgado. We don't want that. We want to make sure that all of the voices are heard. And the survey approach is really the only way to ensure that, because many of those folks are not online. And
how do you reach them? You're set. You have people on the booth.
Oh yeah.
On the ground.
So I can give you a short answer or a long answer. So the short answer is yes. It's a face-to-face survey where we had enumerators go out into the field and ask people a set of questions that we then fed into our knowledge graph.
Wow.
The longer answer is that we also made sure, to the greatest extent possible, that the people who were asking those questions were also members of the community to prevent biases from the answers, right? Because if I ask you something about violence in your community, it'd probably be very different than somebody who lives next door to you, right? So the data we're working with here, and again, this is the data for the remote sensing approach. So that's what I'm going to focus on now. We largely have 2 sets of data here. So the first is news coverage. I mean, you could probably imagine what that looks like, right? We look at news that is focused on this particular area. You can see the sources listed there. There isn't a ton of coverage about Cabo Delgado. We only have a few hundred articles, but the good thing is those articles are, of course, very rich. It's long text. They're curated, and they're well written and in English. But news only gets you so far. So we also had to identify basically social media outlets that were talking about this conflict. And to that end, we found that there was a Telegram channel. It's called Pinnacle News discussion. So it's people ostensibly talking about the articles in Pinnacle News, but not really. It's really just a chat concerned with the events in Cabo Delgado, Mozambique, where anybody can contribute. I'm not really sure what happened there. There's supposed to be a little video, but I mean, these people really, many of them really live in the area, and they really have firsthand knowledge of what's happening. So very common for people to post videos. In this case, this is a video of a person who was accused of being a member of Al-Shabaab. Also there are voice notes of people sharing firsthand experiences with the violence that they saw on the ground, etc. From here, we have about 60,000 messages. And if you've ever looked at social media data, you can already anticipate the problems that there might be there, right? We don't have context. Somebody says there was an attack. Okay, where, when, who, right? It's scattered, right? Topics change quickly. People aren't always, the most friendly or the most cordial in talking to each other. And it's also colloquial and in Portuguese. So fortunately for us, the two languages we really have to contend with here are English and Portuguese. So this really doesn't become a translation task. Google Translate does Portuguese quite well. Very few problems. So generally speaking, what we do is we translate it to English and kind of move on with our lives. So we are ultimately dealing with English text here at the end of the day. So now I'm going to walk you very quickly through the pipeline that we built for that English text. So the first thing we do is event extraction. That should be at the bottom. But basically, what we're doing here is we're kind of pulling out these features from the text. So here in the middle is kind of a passage, not unlike a passage we might see in a Telegram message or in a news article, albeit focused on New York. And these are the things that we pull out. So we have the trigger for the event. So for example, toured here would be the trigger of an event. We have the arguments. So who toured, right? And who toured what? So Pataki toured countries. We also have support for temporal analysis. So what things come after what? So toured has to happen after something's declared. Declared has to happen after something's maintained. And we also try to get a semblance of how long this might have taken, right? And this is basically from background knowledge about how long these verbs can often take. So this is based on a pipeline developed by Nanyun Peng at UCLA. And this gave us kind of a first, foothold on this event extraction framework. Next, I'm going to talk about some of the measures that we extract. So with Christina, we built a moral foundations classification tool. Basically, what we did here is we trained contextualized language models that capture the semantics and improve basically the recognition of moral expressions. I'm going to talk about this later, but we also further improved it using some of the survey data. Here, all we're doing is we're trying to build a better model for this remote sensing approach. It leverages labeled data with moral foundations to train those models. So here are two of the data sets we used, and those are, pretty much, they're very famous moral foundations data sets that can be useful for fine-tuning these models. And of course, we found that in doing so, we were able to get much better performance, right? So our F1 greatly outpaces things like frame axis and your random baselines. Also importantly, if you look at moral foundations, and I should say every moral foundation has two poles. So like, for example, there's fairness, that's a moral foundation. And fairness has both fairness on one side and cheating on the other. And when we look at the classifications made by our model, we can see that it actually separates those two poles much better than if we hadn't done this fine tuning with the labeled data. So there on the top, there's the fine tuning, right? You can see the red and the blue are mostly separate. And there on the bottom, you can see that they are pretty much on top of each other.
Nice.
Next, quickly, I'm going to talk about emotion extraction. So we also worked to build a better emotion classifier to identify these emotions in text. What we did is we started with span emo, and then Christina and her group further fine-tuned that to identify more emotion. And at the end of the day, we have an emotion classifier that supports 11 emotions, and it gets really good classification performance. So at this point, we have our events, right, that we pulled out. We have our emotions, and we have our moral foundations. And from that, we can build a knowledge graph. So using KGTK, which is a tool that was developed in Jay's group, we have this nice, rich representation for a knowledge graph. So here's one example, right? State fighters attack again the barracks of the Mozambican forces. The sentence is much longer than that, it's truncated, but you can see here what was pulled out, right? So here we see the event extraction, the events, and we also see the graphical representation of that event. If we were to click that link, which I'm not going to in the interest of time, you could zoom out and you could see the scores for emotions and moral foundations. This is the real visualization of the front end developed by Gleb, and it allows you to very quickly kind of navigate that knowledge graph in KGTK. Yeah.
So the tag of conflict and attack, is that given by the event extraction method?
It is, yeah, that's a good point. So conflict attack, so there's this thing called the ACE taxonomy, which tries to like taxonomize every event along these kind of like 19 or 21 dimensions. It's like it has everything. It supposedly has everything that people could experience. Like it has marriage, it has death, it is here. It also has conflicts and things like that. And what's happening here is basically it's looking at the verbs that are being used in the triggers, and it's trying to classify it along those things based upon the triggers that it extracted. But that's not all. So another thing we really focused on was causal language. So causal language is really important when you want to understand a person's mental model. So it doesn't, and if you want to understand somebody's behavior, right? So it doesn't really matter if you believe that, say, vaccines will kill you. I mean, it doesn't matter if that's true. It matters if you believe it, because if you believe it, your actions are going to reflect that, right? So to the best extent possible, we want to make sure that we understand people's causal representations through language. We're not the first to do that. In 2021, there is this approach called SCIT or SITE. And basically what they did is they used CNN, this really complicated architecture, to identify causal relationships. One of our team members, Hunter, what Hunter did is he decided, okay, well, what we can do is we can use a lot more data with a kind of a transformer architecture, and maybe we'll do better. So all he did was he took a really simple transformer architecture. He identified many different data sets with causal claims in them and used it to fine tune the model. And on the right, you can see that paid off. So he did a little bit better, right, in terms of predictive accuracy. Okay, 4%, great. Okay, but what's more exciting about this is he was able to identify these kinds of longer spans in these causal utterances. So an example of that is shown there in the bottom. Insurgents overtook the capital, leading the government to collapse. So Skeet would not be able to look all the way forward to collapse, but our approach is able to. One of the things we're working on, but we don't have slides in here, is trying to identify implicit utterances of causality. So like if you say, hey, I knocked my water over, the table was wet, you and I know that that's the relationship, is because the water was knocked over that the table was made wet. Computers, not so much, right? So we want to be able to extend that to identify these things. Another thing we can do is we can take all of these causal claims, X causes Y, and we can build up a graphical structure of those causal claims. And then we can begin to do analysis on that graph. And we can start to see at a high level what causal claims are held by a particular group. Using this structure, we can also compare kind of these maps, right? So what causal claims are present in one group, but on the other, and so on and so forth. Before I move on from this topic, just want to plug that you can use this yourself. I did not intentionally obscure that URL. So if you go to causal-claims.isi.edu, you yourself can upload a series of text and you can get it tagged for causal claims. It'll make that graph I just showed you, etc. Please consider using it. So before I move on, I just want to remind you that, of course, the reason we did that is because we wanted to understand better how people are behaving in these situations, right? We wanted to know what are the underlying dynamics of violence. So what we did is we took this knowledge graph and we fed it to one of our team members who is a former intelligence analyst, and he was looking at these things. And this is kind of the high level story that he was able to tell with that data. And indeed, we later found out this is correct. This is actually what's happening on the ground. So the first kind of step of this cycle is that people in Cabo Delgado are really annoyed with their government, the government of Mozambique. I probably should have a map of Mozambique on here to show why this is, but basically the capital of the country is in the very, very south. It's called Maputo. It's very far away from Cabo Delgado, about as far away as you can get. And the government really doesn't give them any resources, despite them asking for it. And the thinking about this is that really this insurgency has nothing to do with Al-Shabaab or ISIS or anything like that. It's a bunch of starving people who want resources and want jobs, and they go out and they loot because they need to, right, for their livelihoods. So anyways, this whole thing starts with government inaction driving Al-Shabaab rage. You can see there at the bottom, there's a little excerpt about Nyusi's the president, about how they want to, behead him and kill him, et cetera. And that Al-Shabaab rage then drives the attacks. And indeed, we can see this in the knowledge graph, right? We see a spike in rage before there is a spike in attacks. We see this time and time and time again. Attacks drive terror and rage in civilians. And then that rage drives retaliation. So what does that mean? There are many militia groups in Cabo Delgado who largely were left to fend for themselves. And when they get attacked by Al-Shabaab, they retaliate. And this increases the total amount of violence in the region. Yes?
So do you actually see content generated by people who are sympathetic towards Al-Shabaab?
Yeah, very much so. So that Telegram channel I was telling you about, they officially have a rule that's like, no ISIS, right? But that rule gets broken all the time. And you very frequently will see some people pop in there and talk about how, ISIS is the coolest thing ever and you're all going to die and stuff. Very frequent, yes. And then that retaliation, what it does is it ties the civilians to the government. So from the Al-Shabaab perspective, they say, well, you're fighting us, the government's fighting us, you must be the same thing. And this kind of feeds into this feedback loop here. All right, now I'm going to get to Abigail's stuff, which is the survey that we ran. Okay, so yeah, everything I presented so far is about the remote sensing approach, right? May or may not be right. We really want to make sure that it is. We want to make sure that we're getting accurate insights from this region. We also want to make sure that our models are being fed data from the people who are actually on the ground, right? I was showing you those moral foundation models. They're, online annotators, right? Are they representative of your average Mozambican? Probably not. So what we needed to do is we needed to go there and get data from them so that we could be sure that our inferences and models are correct. So to do that, what we did is we conducted face-to-face interviews. We wanted to make sure that they were actually conducted, those interviews, right? Because we're not there to watch them. So they are geo-fenced. We know where they happened. And we used 2 companies to conduct them. Both of them, what they did is they had other people validate that there were 2 people, that this is what they said indeed, et cetera, so that we knew that these things actually happened. Moreover, the questions were developed by us, the research team, specifically Carolyn, who's a political scientist at UCLA. But we need to make sure that those questions are being asked correctly in a way that somebody in the region would actually understand and respond to them. So to that, we had them back translated. Oh, and furthermore, we needed to make sure that asking these questions wouldn't get somebody killed, right? Which is a real concern. And indeed, we did have to conduct, to cut some of our questions because they weren't particularly safe to ask. Yes?
So this is all done in Portuguese?
It's done in the local language of the village they went to.
Okay.
So this
how can you check any of this stuff?
So it gets translated. This is what back translation is. So it goes from English to Portuguese to the local language, back to Portuguese, back to English. And if in that process, the question remains the same, that means you have a good question. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't, right? Which it's like the telephone game. It changes dramatically. And we should probably either cut it or ask it in a different way.
Wait, and that process is done automatically, or?
No, not at all. Yeah, there are at least 2 people in the process, right? So there's somebody from our team and somebody from their team making sure that this happens correctly. And we also held focus groups before we deployed these things in the field, just to make sure that they were, the right questions to be asking, et cetera, et cetera.
But these are you're eliciting people to help you create these questions, and then you go out and you use these questions?
We make the questions ourselves
Gotcha,
based
okay.
upon our understanding and our needs. This whole process I'm describing right now is just really sanity checking that the questions are going to be asked correctly.
Okay.
They're in the field, and that they're actually being asked, basically.
Okay.
That's what this whole process is about.
I thought I had heard, like at the beginning, I thought I understood that like you were using, you know, this crowdsourced information to help I come up with the questions that were gonna get at the information that you were missing.
For the purposes of this talk, no. We did do some of that. It wasn't particularly successful because most of those questions failed this process that I'm talking about here.
Right. Okay.
We treaded in those waters, but it didn't really work out. So all the questions you're going to hear about here are handmade.
Okay, cool.
Also, we needed to ensure that the populations we were talking to are representative. That's easier to do when you have good data, right? But it turns out the last census of Cabo Delgado was conducted in 2007, right? So that's 16 years ago. We compared to the best we could, but when things don't match up, it's really hard to know why. One of the big outcomes of this violence is people move, right? They are displaced. We have no idea if things are the same as they were 16 years ago. In fact, if there's anything we know, it's that they probably aren't, right? So also the sampling method, we had to change that throughout the process. So the first, we started out with a convenience sample. So we would send people out and say, hey, talk to who you can, right? This is a dangerous environment, just try to get some surveys. Second, we were able to use a traditional household approach using something similar to the birthday method, hopefully to get more representative data. Some of the questions we ask people about causal factors. I'll talk about this a little bit later. We have Mad Libs questions to calibrate our text classification. We also have an approach to adjust inaccurate base rates from other sources and to basically assess locals' knowledge about violence. And this is all done with relatively low touch because it has to be, right? We don't have a lot of opportunities to talk to people. So what are these survey questions I'm talking so much about? Well, here are some of them, right? I think this is really the most important deciding factor in the survey. So when an enumerator approaches a respondent, their software really flips a coin and they say, okay, this person is either a conflict reporter or a conflict forecaster, split down the middle, 50-50. Conflict reporters, what they do is they tell us about past violence, what happened in the past. You can see the questions here. They also have check boxes for different types of violence that we know are prevalent in the region. And we ask them how they heard about it. Did they see it? Did somebody tell them about it? Did they read it about it in the news? On the other side of the coin, we have forecasters, right? We ask, do you think there will be violence in the next 2 weeks? How confident are you? Would others give the same prediction as you, et cetera? And, you know, we could ask these questions, right, to like somebody in a think tank who studies these things, but that's not really the point here, right? We want to see what do people on the ground think and how well does that actually end up panning out. I'll skip over this slide for the most part. We ask a lot of demographic questions as well. What is your, ethnic group, religion, age range, et cetera. We also ask them about their social and information networks. Another thing we do is we look at the moral foundations of the people we're talking to. So on the left, you can see we have this kind of moral foundation ranking question. We say like basically rank which one of these things is they're the most important to you. That's a little wonky. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But we also have this Mad Libs question, right? So we say things like, complete the following. I believe my people have been betrayed when blank, and we ask them to fill in the blank. And then that becomes text data that we then have to work with. So turning back to this conflict reporting and conflict forecasting effort, right? So this is kind of the base rates of what we see. So among the conflict reporters, both in the convenience sample and the traditional household sample, about 19-ish% say, yes, there was something that happened. And in the conflict forecasters, we see that the base rate is actually quite similar, somewhere between 17 and 23%. And perhaps most promising is if this bottom chart here, what we did is we basically lagged the forecasts to line up with the reports. Yes?
A question about, like, on the left there, where you asked if there was, in the last week, so. You know that there was, or it doesn't matter if you know that there was or wasn't?
Very good question. I'm gonna get into that. That's really important. Can I just, I'll do that in a couple slides. You're absolutely right, though. That's really important. Accurate ground truth for sure. What's heartening is if you lag these, so they line up, right? You can see that the base rates are actually quite similar throughout the weeks, right? So there's some sort of consistency here between what the reporters are saying is going to happen and what the forecasters actually say did happen, or the other way around. Okay, Yigal, here we go. So there is a reference data set for this violence, right? It's called ACLED. I'm not sure if you're familiar with ACLED, the Armed Conflicts and Location Events data set. ACLED is a really great resource. They try their best to catalog all violence around the world, anywhere in the world. And it becomes this nice tabular data set that we can work with. ACLED is particularly awesome because they put an immense amount of effort into specifically Cabo Delgado, Mozambique, through this Cabo Delgado project. One thing I want to point out, you might be familiar with IQs and GDEL. ACLED is very different from those in that it doesn't only rely on text analysis of news articles. They actually have a network of reporters that feed them information about what's going on the ground. So ostensibly, it should be more reliable than those other sources, right? But nevertheless, I mean, do you really trust any group to be able to be exposed to all of the violence that's happening in a region such as this, right? Stepping aside for a second, for example, there's in Ethiopia, there's a small massacre every day. About 40 to 50 people are killed, and it's very seldom reported in ACLED, let alone anywhere else, right? We only know about this from the partnerships we have with some of these groups in Africa who look at these things. Okay, now Yigal, you're not off the hook yet. Next thing. All right, so locals as conflict reporters, right? So here's one example of an event that was verified by ACLED, right? So those pink dots are our reporters telling us that something happened in the last week. Specifically, I believe they said that it was a beheading. And there, the green dot is an ACLED report. So basically 3 days before we talk to these people, you can read the report there. Islamist militia killed between 2 and 4 people near the village of Pulo. All victims were beheaded, right? Okay, that's a win, right? Our reporter said something happened. ACLED said something happened. We can triangulate it and feel pretty confident that that actually did pan out. Okay, now let's get a little messier here. ACLED actually misses many events. So here's another example. Here are 5 reports of a beheading, right? 5 separate people said that a beheading happened in the last week. But ACLED does not have a corresponding record in its database to support that, right? And if you kind of look at how often ACLED verifies something as a function of how many of our forecasters said it, you see that there are a lot missing, right? Okay, so maybe if one guy said something, maybe it was hearsay, maybe he's making something up, who knows? It's about 20%. But if 2 people say something, it only goes up to about 25%. And there are many events here that are completely unsubstantiated by ACLED. And when you start to see 3, 4, 5 people all saying that something happened, I tend to believe them, especially given the way that this is sampled. And this really goes to show that ACLED, despite their amazing and best efforts, are still missing plenty of things that are happening in Cabo Delgado. And in fact, Merle, what he did is he built a pretty simple statistical technique to kind of estimate how many of these events go unreported. And you can see that's a wide interval, right? But we think that it's somewhere between 3 to 25 times the number of attacks that actually show up in ACLED are the true number, with a 95% confidence. There at the bottom, we can break it out by different event types, ambush, beheading, and we can start to see, that there are different rates for these different types of events. But the bottom line is, overall, the attacks, which are the things that we're most interested in, about 3 to 25x under reported there. Yes.
So these reports from conflict reporters that you get to show that these 5 beheadings happen. But there are 5 reports of the same event or 5 different beheadings that happen?
That's a good question. So the fidelity of the data, it could be 5 different ones.
Okay.
They were all asked on the same day, though, which is important. But nevertheless, this guy could be thinking about this beheading. This guy could be thinking about another one. We don't know. We're not sure. When we're thinking about this, we generally tend to think that it's just one, but could be 5. You're right. Could be more. We just don't know. We don't have that fidelity. Yes.
So how does ACLA get their data?
So they have a network of journalists who report things that they've heard about, that they've seen, et cetera, and they do a lot of data quality checks on top of this. It's not completely manual. They do use tools like GDELT to start to see their understanding of what happened, but ultimately everything is manually verified, and that's a big departure from things like GDELT and IQs.
Okay. Do you think your method captures more because it's so community driven?
I do, yeah. I think the bottom line is a lot of these journalists that are reporting are in the bigger cities, the safer places in Cabo Delgado, like Pemba, and our enumerators were able to go to less safe places. I mean, we did a lot of work to make sure that they weren't going anywhere super dangerous, but we did go outside of Pemba. I'll say that.
They're like revenge, like when beheading happens, is there like a counter, like a revenge killing or something on top of that?
Yeah, very often. Those militia groups, for sure, they do exactly that. That's kind of like the rage feedback loop. It's like
the gang shooting.
Yeah, exactly. Al-Shabaab, it's really not that much different, right? As Al-Shabaab comes in, kills people, they have militia, they go out and they seek revenge, and it just keeps getting worse and worse.
Okay, no other types of killing.
So we have ambush, we have attack, we have battles, we have women were violated, etc.
Attack doesn't necessarily result in death.
So, okay, so beheadings are really important for these groups. So this is something kind of gruesome that I learned throughout the course of this project, is that every one of these groups has a slightly different beheading style, and you can.
Oh my God.
This is true. And you can learn kind of where people were trained, where these insurgents were trained based upon the way they do beheadings. That's why there is particular interest in beheadings in these types of data sets, because then you can start to go back and there is, I went to this conference in Mozambique last year, and there was somebody who was really into this stuff, and he was saying that it's very likely that they were trained in, I believe it was Somalia, because the way they behead people is similar to the way that the Somali insurgents do it. Anyways, beheadings they're a special case because of this and other things.
What's violating?
Violating women, they're violated. Okay, I'm a little behind here, but I do want to tell you one more thing, at least, is, okay, locals as conflict forecasters, right? That was the other side of this coin. So we have this question, do you believe that there will be a violent clash, battle, or attack next week involving security forces? And you can see these green circles, right? All of them said, yes, I think something's going to happen. Yes, I think something's going to happen, et cetera. Then a week later, we went back to that village and we talked to other folks, and they said, yes, something happened, right? There are at least 4 pins there, although they're pretty close together, basically saying that, yes, there was an event that went down, right? That's kind of good for us, right? Because that means that there's, again, synchronicity between the weeks. And it also verifies that, some of these forecasts are indeed correct. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to see, okay, what basically information do we get about future violence from forecasts and from reports. So gotta love it. What happened here is we did basically a mutual information approach. And the question we're trying to answer is how much information do locals' forecasts provide about future violence? And to say it another way, basically how much mutual information do forecasts have with future reports conditioning on the past? So if you observe a forecast from the empirical distribution along with a future report, will there be basically a statistical association for controlling for the observation of a past report as well? So what we did is we sampled a bunch of triplets of past reports, future reports, and forecasts, and we computed basically the mutual information between these things. Here, what I'm showing you is the normalized mutual information. So basically the thing that had the highest mutual information is 1, which is there on the left. And was kind of getting eaten up in this slide, unfortunately, is that when we look at the past reports, mutual information on future reports, the mutual information normalized is 0.43. When we add in the locals forecasts, right, it just about doubles, right? There's way more mutual information from adding in those forecasts there than there is without them. And to kind of zoom out, why is this, right? Because people know, people have information about what's happening.
You just lost your lines.
Oh no, it's fine. We don't need them. We can talk. So people know, right? They know what's going on the ground. And this is another thing that I kind of really changed my view of the world throughout the project. Is like, I kind of had this cartoonish view starting in that was like, they're the bad guys over here and they're the good guys over here. And then they fight each other. But that's not true. It's completely wrong, actually. So the more accurate case is, there's, again, a starving person or a person who doesn't have a job in some village in Cabo Delgado, and an Al-Shabaab guy calls him up and says, hey, I'll give you $200 if you plant a roadside bomb on this road. And they do it. So this is key because they're going in and out of these different communities. And in doing so, they take that information with them that we're able to pick up on in our survey. Are we back? No. I don't know what happened. Let's try it again.
You're picking up the information not from the Al-Shabaab people. You're picking up the information they communicate to the locals that they're recruiting in the village.
That's what I'm trying to say. Is like certainly there are Al-Shabaab people. Like there is some leadership, however scattered it may be, but there are also many people who are Al-Shabaab like. They kind of go in and out based upon need. They don't necessarily want to do these things, but man, those $200 sure look nice, So those same folks often can give us information that we can use to do better prediction. How are we doing?
Again.
You just
But it's just that.
Oh, okay. What's going on here?
it's that Apple screen thing mirroring.
All right. Anybody see a?
Yep.
Okay. All right.
But are those in the middle? Sorry.
Huh?
I'm
Sorry?
focused on but there are those kind of who are not as don't have the same degree of extremism. Are they kind of the majority of people? I guess how big is the population that is like that lives in between?
That's a good question.
The useful, can you call them useful idiots or something like that?
I wouldn't go that far. I would say really my view of these people is that they are, unfortunate and that they're kind of being manipulated by those who do have money, right? And can push them into this. And I don't know because Abigail, that's a type of question that we couldn't ask because we can't say, hey, are you an Al-Shabaab? We'll say what? Another question we had to ask is or had to cut is basically their religious ties. So only about half of our data even has religion because that's a first step recruiting tool for Al-Shabaab. They'll say, hey, are you Islamic? And then they'll go from there. And when our enumerators were asking that, eyebrows were raised, right? So Yes.
I had a question regarding the emotion detection model and then the other models as well. In a region which is torn with conflict, I'm sure there are like outliers of things like fear, anticipation. So what was the treatment done in the models to kind of to make sure that it's a fair model and then for the other models as well?
And you are helping me land this plane. Thank you, Parth. All right, so this is what I'm going to talk about next. Yes, so I'm focusing now on the moral foundation model. So it's not quite your question. I don't have this thing over here anymore, so I'm just going to have to look at it. All right, so reminder, we had these Mad Libs questions, right? Fill in the blanks, okay? So we go out and we'd ask people, fill in the blank. I believe my people have been betrayed when blank. And we get a whole bunch of text that way. And that text is naturally labeled for the moral foundation that it should be associated with. Now what we want to do is we want to make sure we're labeling people's text from the Telegram channel, from the news articles, et cetera, correctly in the context of that group. So an off-the-shelf model is going to do that for us. We were talking about Bert at the beginning of this talk, right? This is actually Bert trying to complete the sentence. I believe blank is sacred. Right? These are the most probable things for blank. I believe it is sacred. I believe this, nothing. I believe what is sacred. I believe everything is sacred. Not really useful, right? Not a lot there. So Nagar, what she did is she took this model and she updated based upon the responses that we got to the questions. So before she could do that, here's some first analysis about what people actually said for this survey question. So I believe blank is sacred. I believe praying is sacred. That sounds reasonable, right? I believe the mosque is sacred. I believe life, cool. I believe not killing people is sacred. I believe speaking transparently is sacred, etc. So again, using this data, what Nagar did is she changed Bert's pre-training approach. So that it's, some inputs are masked with the mask token, and basically she fine-tuned it so that Bert would guess the words that we got in the survey, right? And we don't have ground truth for this survey data or for any of the text that we get from Telegram. But the good thing is that when we look at this data, we see that, hey, we can actually better label some of these things. So we can score more instances. So here we're seeing kind of like this radial chart with the before and the after. So without surveys means before, and using surveys means after. What are your brothers? See, it couldn't say anything about it before, but now it can say something. Okay, this is probably something to do with loyalty, right? Which makes sense. And then the other is the day before the attack on the Palm, the WFP, that's another name for Al-Shabaab, went to leave food there. Okay, so that's a little bit about care, and mostly about care, and a little bit about fairness, whereas before we couldn't say anything about it at all.
Couldn't WFP be World Food Program?
It's like Walla something.
Okay.
I don't remember exactly, but
yeah,
that's true. Yeah. Okay, what's that slide say? Yeah, let's cut it here. So we've done so much cool stuff with like LLMs and things like that. Like Jay's group did this really awesome thing where we figured out that you can, forecast violence with very little data with an LLM. We also found that by kind of like hiding the words, it does just as well. That's super cool. We also have this kind of like predict what locals would predict task where we used LLMs with all of the data that I'm talking about here in order to kind of contextualize the LLM and get a better response. But I guess that's going to have to be saved for the sequel. And I'll stop here and take any questions.
All the questions that came up during your talk in the Q&A. So one is from Uchenna, who said, can we separate the behavioral model from the politics of mineral resources? It seems like everywhere you have oil and gas, you have insurgencies and militias.
I'm not sure what to say to that. Can I separate the behavioral model from the presence of? So what it sounds like what they're talking about is the resource curse. Basically, whenever something's found, then violence spurs around that. But I think that some of the things that we're finding here should generalize to any other case where these things happen, where there's this type of violence. And in fact, we're testing that, right? So today's talk was entirely about Mozambique. In July of this year, we actually turned our focus to Buenaventura, Colombia. There's no LNG, But there are, many different gang groups that are, fighting for power in that area of the world.
There's drugs, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right. I hope that answers that person's question.
And one more from Heidi. So the question is, how are the informants paid? Is there an inadvertent incentive for predictive reports to be made to happen?
Good question. Respondents are not paid at all. So that was part of our kind of like security consideration, is that we didn't want to incentivize somebody to participate who didn't otherwise want to. If you don't feel comfortable taking our survey for any reason, then you don't miss out on anything. So yeah, there was no incentive really whatsoever. In fact, we made sure the survey took at most 10 minutes. And there's really a disincentive in the fact that you lose 10 minutes of your life, but that's it.
Other questions from the audience?
So, and I can't remember how you phrased it at the beginning, but just in terms of how this can be used, do you think, so you're talking about like you want to predict violence, and
yeah, I didn't get there. I'm sorry. That is something we've spent a lot of time doing, building models and that kind of things.
Right. Or like, sorry, forecast. And do you think this really amazing body of work, this can be used to forecast? Like you're looking at specific places it could break out. Do you like also how it would spread, or that's kind of connecting with other diffusion models? Or
you bring up a really important point, which is we want to make sure that these things aren't overfit to the one region we've studied so far, which is exactly why we've gone to other regions to see how generalizable this is, right? Does that answer your question? Maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if the model, if like your mental model there is that like violence crops up in different places, but if it's a spreading event,
oh, you mean like those, so some of the insights we found, like the rage feedback loop and
yeah,
things like that, is that going to generalize? Probably not. Different regions are going to have different dynamics. But the important thing is that our system can actually pull up those dynamics, right? So as I mentioned, like when we were looking at the rage feedback loop, we had an intelligence officer in the loop, right, to kind of like contextualize and understand what the story was there. That's still needed. I don't even necessarily think that's a bug, because really what we're trying to do is we're trying to give them the materials they need to construct those stories kind of faster. So yeah, it's not all out of it for sure.
Right. Oh, okay.
So I have a question about the unfortunate people that we were talking about who got paid to do like sort of bad things. What? I guess but like you think they would actually tell you that they are, because you said that they are doing the forecasting, right? So they actually tell you that I'm gonna do something.
No, they're just saying like, yeah, I think something's gonna happen next week. Like, because they do have information that stuff's gonna go down, and maybe not even the person who did it. Maybe they just got a call, right? And they're like, I don't want to, but stuff's gonna happen, right? Like we have no. So first of all, we didn't collect any PI on these people, but second of all, we don't intentionally, we don't know necessarily their alliances with these kinds of things, because these kinds of reasons that get weird. Yes.
So the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that the reason to go into coveted Colorado was to sort of validate your online findings from online resources, right? Was there a comparison that was done at the end? So, or were people even asked in surveys what emotion they feel or they express certain events, and sort of collaborate and see offline behavior translates, or is representative of online behavior?
I wouldn't say behavior so much, but I would say I would remind you of the like moral foundation models, right? Through the combination of those two things, we were able to score people's text that wasn't able to be scored before. I think what you're asking is like a somewhat different question, but it's not less interesting. It's just it's cool. It's like, people are talking about these types of events or protests online. Are they actually going to happen? That kind of stuff. That's not really the waters we've tread so far, although that could be an interesting extension of what we're trying to do.
Clarification from Jenna was, that question about mineral resources. The question was, well, maybe are these companies, do they have a vested interest in fomenting violence, is my paraphrase of the question. So is there any type of causal attribution?
Oh, I see. I get it. Okay. No, actually, in fact, this insurgency set Total back at least 3 years in terms of really closer to 4 now in terms of when they could actually start extracting that gas. I mean, they lost a ton of money, right? They put 20 billion in. They got their plant like more than halfway done. Then they had to evacuate due to all the violence. And actually, just last month, the person who was kind of leading the insurgency, his name's Omar. He was killed by Mozambique and Rwanda, and just now they're finally starting to talk about like reopening that plant. So yeah, Total definitely did not benefit from this in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. One last question from Nathan. How do you think phone surveys would compare to face-to-face one, so in person versus?
That's a good question, actually. So that's something that we're doing in Colombia. Is what we're doing is we're on our first pass, we're asking people who are willing to give us their phone number, and then we call them again and see how they, their opinions have updated and so on and so forth. The reason we didn't do phone surveys at all in Mozambique is because so few people actually have phones. It's relatively low connectivity up there, and as I mentioned, phone connectivity would be biased towards the wealthiest, best off folks, and I don't think it would give us good data.
Okay, well, I think we're at noon, so let's thank Fred again. That was a great talk.